How often does your website go down?
It does, but that has to do with where it's hosted and a very slack system administrator who doesn't take care of it.
So we're going to open it up for questions. That guy over there. Questions end with a question mark, just so everybody knows.
I'm Jeremy, and I have different freedoms online with my own name. So the point I disagree with you about anonymous is that I don't think you can call it a movement or call it a day. I think it is vaguely a concept that some people recognize themselves into from time to time. But it is out there. And so don't we have a collective responsibility, as we know that it will be instrumentalized to push for cybersecurity, bullshit, and control of the net? Don't we have a collective responsibility to tell what represents an action that we consider legitimate as a common sense of justice, put forward, what we think is manipulation and what we think is raw bullshit? And in that sense, aren't we all anonymous?
So, okay, first in terms of your first statement, which is it's just an idea, it is absolutely the case that it is an idea, and there's, for example, countless people on Twitter who take the name to tweet in the name of anonymous. There's many individuals who make videos who may not log on IRC, but sociologically, you know, if IRC for whatever reason disappeared tomorrow, like you just couldn't have anonymous the way that you do now. There's stable places, there's tight friendships that form. You know, I mean, I feel like I'm, you know, ranting, but that is what I'm doing. Because I do think it's really important to portray this, both for kind of, it's empirically correct, and then also because I am concerned about creating anonymous as this scary goblin, right? I do think both, and this happens within the movement and should happen outside. I don't think we should just uncritically embrace what they do. And with anti-sec, for example, there had been a lot of criticism from within Anonymous, including kind of rumors that this was a government infiltration, that they were too kind of risque and controversial. So I think that's incredibly important. And finally, I do think it's important to keep open this idea that we can all be anonymous and anyone can be. But I don't think that contradicts the fact that there is some stability there.
You, right there.
Hi, my name is Leah, and I work with AnonLG, which is the National Lawyers Guild's project to hook up people accused of participating in anonymous with defense attorneys. And I want to know whether you have any suggestions for a way that we can talk about anonymous, we generally, not just attorneys or people like that, that captures that sense of it as a political thing. Which I think is important when you're working to defend people, but that also at least addresses or deals with what I think is a problem, which is that oftentimes the people who are caught, and by caught I mean accused, like arrested and accused, are people who kind of were just not like together enough. Like it's kind of like the cannon fodder. We all know that like the FBI and the CIA go for low-hanging fruit. We've seen it in terrorism stings, and we've seen it in stings against Anonymous too. So there's sort of two tracks that you can take with defending these people, where you can say like, look, this person wasn't really politically relevant. This person was just someone who got caught up in this thing, and they're, essentially just, which is, a drone, and they didn't know what they were doing. Or you can talk about it in a politicized sense. And I'm wondering if you have any suggestions for ways that we can talk about this that can kind of capture both, or that can say one without not saying the other.
That's a big, tough question. I think I'm going to find you afterwards. I do think, you can sociologically represent it as sort of concentric circles where some people are really involved, other people are less involved, which happens with any kind of social movement. That's not particular to Anonymous, and I think that helps because the more, in some ways it's very different, and that's what makes it special, but in some ways where you could portray how it is not different so that judges can be like, oh, it's not just this weird thing that popped up out of 4chan in the last 5 years, would go a far way in terms of making it something sensible to the judges.
All right, preference is being given to questions not for Biella. You.
Yes,
so
Sorry,
a common
Biella.
thread between what all of you talked about was the importance of who's doing what, right? And like when that person is like small but secret, when that person is network but anonymous, when that person is advertising themselves as being from a particular group. Do you guys see there being a situation where claiming your identity versus obscuring your identity makes certain political actions more or less effective in the various areas you're looking at?
That's a great question.
Yes.
Why did you stay secret, for instance?
Well, originally it's because I didn't want to lose my job, right? I was a professor at a school in Chicago, and especially early on, the account was pretty vile, right? And I was definitely concerned as the follower count grew and as attention grew and scaled to a national level. I felt like I probably had a certain level of cover, and at that point, what I really wanted to do was finish the story, right? And because I knew it was documenting the election, it was not like the idea of doing 4 years of that shit, like not all right. So that was true. The other thing is that I took a lot of, I loved Dan Lyon's Fake Steve Jobs when it was anonymous, when you didn't know who was doing it, because that allowed you to suspend disbelief a lot more and enter into the world that he was building, right? As soon as you think of an author and can put a picture to the author's name, that suspension of disbelief in terms of a first-person narrative becomes a little bit more difficult, right? Especially one that kind of takes place in that kind of real-time, it's snowing in this world and it's snowing in your world. You want to be able to, have that. And then the other reason is I'm, frankly not a fame whore, right? Like, I remember writing to Alexis Madrigal at the time and was like, I'm really ambivalent about this because I'm worried that it's going to make my life a little bit crazy, right? And what I defined in my head in writing that as a little bit crazy and what happened, was this to that. Like, it went way crazier than I wanted, expected, anything. So, there was definitely a protection of self involved in that as well.
Cool. I think that one of the central tensions that defines the internet, right, is this huge place where a lot of people go to find folks who have some kind of affinity to them, right? It's not necessarily as simple as saying like racial or gender, though that happens. But a lot of people collected together in spots on the internet because they had something in common, and they wanted to be able to share that experience. Where at the same time, there was this idea, particularly in the early 90s, epitomized by that New Yorker cartoon that, no one on the internet knows that you're a dog, right? There's an idea of like a blanking of identity. And, through Lisa Nakamura's work, and she talked a lot about like digital race and this discussions of like how this plays out online, is that if you were to articulate yourself as an identity against the norm, the assumed norm of the internet being both white and male, to do so was to make yourself a target of hatred, to show that, to say I am different was to bring scorn upon yourself in many, many circles. And so there was always this tension that's there where we're trying to organize, we're trying to be here together, trying to find people who are kinship. And you see this the most in fandom, right? In fandom studies where you can be as obsessive as you want about video games, about Battlestar Galactica, about whatever you want. But if you start bringing in these more uncomfortable elements of like identity, right, then suddenly you can almost become ousted from the crew, right, where people don't want to talk to you anymore. You can ask why, Judy Nails has a 5-string guitar in one version of Guitar Hero and 6-string guitar in another version of Guitar Hero, but you can't ask why you don't have any black guitar players represented. Like, those are questions that are supposed to be off boundaries. So the idea of somebody articulating their identity almost as like a political act online, it can be that, it can exist as that. It can also just exist as a way in which someone is exploring their self. So like Dana Boyd talks a lot about this when she talks about how the internet helped her to formulate her queer identity. It gave her a very safe space for her to find other people like her, but in this realm of anonymity, so that she could be out to certain people, but be exploring in a safer, maybe non-physical space, what it meant to be queer and explore these things in a way that allowed her to figure out who she was, right? You don't always want to make that explicit. You don't always want to be hidden, and I think that the internet's a tension of like trying to negotiate these two things. And then when you look at broader discussions, like who gets to determine what the internet is, we saw that great talk yesterday on global memes and global buzzes, and and Ethan's work more generally has been discussing kind of like who is the we here, right?
Yeah.
We have all of these different little pockets of we around the internet, but it's not necessarily what gets to be seen as the dominant internet culture, right? And so those questions and that tension, I think, categorizes kind of what we do online for all, as all of us.
Yeah, and I mean, I think to me, it's like, it actually, Anonymous is a great example of that, right? Like, they declare we are Legion, right? That doesn't work if you know that it's like 25 people, right? Like, it works because they are declaring themselves anonymous. It is it is an invisible entity that could be 300,000 people or it could be 3 you don't know, right? Like, the power is in that declaration, and that is attached to the anonymity for sure.
I do think also with Anonymous, what's so fascinating is the fact that, because they're pseudo-anonymous at least, it allows for what I think is a pretty remarkable diversity for a kind of political entity, so that you have everything from Sabu, this kind of Puerto Rican from the hood, to kind of hardcore anti-capitalist activists, to people who are part of the 1%, 99% queers. There is something about showing your identity that then causes, people who are like to kind of congregate, and that exists on a spectrum depending on, the situation and the activity involved. But Anonymous, puts that out of the equation, and some very unusual and different types of people come together as a result.
That dude in the far left in the back has had his arm up.
All right, you guy.
I have a question for Biella. I'm sorry. I know a lot of
Stood up for you, man.
You did.
you talked about the ways kind of in which, I guess, the top documents that the media has created, they seem to kind of analyzing mainstream news narratives or historical frames, and oftentimes they're framed as inappropriate, huge, vigorous, or not capable of doing anything legitimate, or that they're radical. I was wondering if you had maybe a suggestion of how to change that mainstream media discourse, because there's a lot of literature that says that that's the way that mainstream media treats social movements in general, because they have an interest in defending the status quo. So looking at kind of doing, Occupy Wall Street, the Tea Party movement, back to students who are deciding the pictures, they've all kind of been treated this way. So is there an answer that you see for that, or is that possible? Do you think that is true?
Right, and it's worth noting, too, that along with representing Anonymous as diffuse and inchoate, there's also this desire to find and hone in on the, 1 or 2 star characters, Sabu, Jeremy Hammond, right, the real shakers and movers, and we're soon going to see a plethora of articles that are probably going to focus in on them because they've been revealed. And mainstream media often likes to make leaders or celebrity leaders out of political movements. It's hard. The media is a kind of machinery itself. I recommend checking out the work of Whitney Phillips, who does this amazing work on trolls. And she looks at how the mainstream media is kind of trollish in its own kind of desire of spectacle, and that kind of accentuates the troll phenomena. It's difficult. You can get in there. I know I've talked to 150 reporters over the last year and a half, and it's had some impact, but one person alone usually can't do it.
Yeah, changing the media's mind is very, very difficult.
Yeah.
Dude in the green shirt. This is the last question. Sorry, guys.
Mostly for Peterson, but it's for everybody too. I want to talk about humor a little bit. So the last video you showed was really interesting because it was using the rhythm of the montage, and it created this tension of comedy. She was using the rhythm of comedy, but it was extremely sober, really quiet, and it's intense. And I wanted to know if you could talk a little bit about how the difficulty of serious issues of identity and race and gender, and then expand it to everybody about, it's so easy, everything's about humor, and it's everyone focuses on that, but there isn't really a good example yet of people doing more serious work without being sort of mocked. The only thing I can think of is there's some flash games from one of the industries where it's you're the pilot of a predator drone, or you go to work every day and you commit suicide, and it seems like that has worked for flash games, but for memes and stuff,
It's a really good question. So I think one of the things that happens when we start talking online, we start using memes, we start using humor, is that you start breaking down boundaries, you start breaking down walls, right? And so humor is actually like one of the best tools. Like there's this talk that Baratunde gave at South by Southwest that was talking about like how satirists are kind of like the forefront in many times of political discourse and political commentary. Because by poking fun at something, one, to actually just, to break it down to like how do you have a good joke, right? How is something funny, right? It has to be kind of familiar. You have to be kind of illuminating something about it. At the same time, you have to understand it well enough to deconstruct it. Like, this is the mentality, and that's why I'm poking fun at, but I understand it, therefore I can parody it, right? There's this idea that kind of needs to be in place as a framework before people can start saying, okay, well, this is what we can do with this meme. And so you saw that with the evolution. It took a while, right? Like, Shit Girl Say was already on its third video, right? Before, Shit White Girls Say to Black Girls came out. And before all the other ones. And once people started figuring out, like, oh, I can pioneer, I can tweak this format, then you start seeing it. I think that on Racialicious, we have a lot of conversations about kind of like what makes a good joke about race, right? Like, how do we define that, and how is that different from a racist joke? And a lot of that conversation is really about how in which we reinforce power structures through things that we do and say, and how people subvert them. All right, and through the things in which we do and say. And so I feel like humor is a really powerful tool. And to speak to the last video, the final video, where again, the pacing is there, and it's like you almost want to laugh at some of the things because you know it's absurd, and you know it's ridiculous, but it's so serious and so painful, you feel like you can't laugh, right? You feel as though like you can't quite articulate it because you know deep down what they're saying is true and right, and this is being used to diminish somebody. And I feel like that message in itself was the most powerful, right? Because there's a lot of different ways in which we could spin this and talk about this, and there's a lot of different ways you can make jokes about, like, about very dark moments in our history and dark moments in society or the things that we do. But having that moment of reflection where you're like, I could laugh, but it's so serious I can't laugh, in itself is, like, I think one of the biggest victories that you can have when you're trying to illuminate what's happening.
Yeah, I mean, I think that it's well documented, and it is certainly not a phenomenon of the internet that humor allows us to laugh at very dark things, right? To laugh at, I mean, the entire Mayor Emanuel account is really about just how fucked Chicago is, like, right? Like, just how 21 years of the Daley administration fucked the city to a point of almost irreparable. You cannot repair it, right? That's not very funny, right? And it's fine to say, but it's not going to go viral, right? And people feel it, right? And it's easier to make a bunch of jokes about this, multi-billion-dollar parking meter deal that doesn't allow the city to get any revenues from its parking meters for the next 75 years, right? It's easier to talk about just sticking your dick in the parking meter and fucking it. That's a lot funnier than and easier to go around than to talk about what really happened, right? And I think that humor allows us to disarm and engage in conversations that we're not able to do. It also, frankly, spreads a lot easier. I mean, there were almost 2,000 tweets in the Mayor Emanuel story, right? And that gave me a lot of chances to figure out, like, which of this variation of the word fuck and something political will go the farthest, right? And so you play with that just to see what happens, right? And so I think that humor is there because it allows us to talk about things that we can't normally kind of talk about in polite company, right? That we can't talk about just in general, whether it's racial issues, whether it's other things. These are hard topics to bring up.
All right, that was awesome. Thanks everybody for coming. I hope it was edifying and entertaining. Go eat lunch.
Thank you.